Us today. Hello, thanks for joining us today. We'll wait just another moment or two to allow everyone to join the session, and then we'll begin. I think we can start. Good afternoon. Welcome to our 10th Lunch and Learn presented by the Charlottesville Police Foundation and the Charlottesville Police Department. My name is Gail Milligan. I'm the Executive Director of the Foundation. Now is such an important time for us as members of the community to understand more about policing and the law, and that makes us excited to be presenting this series and very happy that you're joining us today. We so greatly appreciate the partnership with CPD and the time and effort all of the presenters have invested in bringing this information to us. We also appreciate the support from the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy and from our hosts and friends, Diane and Katie. The Lunch and Learn series is an outcome of our community engagement and is part of our core mission to inform and connect. In each session, members of the CPD will offer unique insight to the work the department does and answer questions you have about that work. Before we begin, I wanted to share a brief overview of our work at CPF. Simply stated, the Charlottesville Police Foundation serves the community by serving the police. We seek to improve the quality of life in Charlottesville by offering a community partner for our police department. The foundation promotes excellence in police services by investing in programs that enhance our department and yet are beyond the reasonable reach of the city's budget. We reward excellence by celebrating the successes of our department and the skills of its officers. And we strengthen the connections between the department and the public through outreach programs and community events. The newest example is this Lunch and Learn series. Best examples of the diverse support we provide include housing grants to officers so they can live in the community they serve, an awards dinner and Officer of the Month program, advanced training for officers, grants for specific needs such as K-9, technology, programs in the community, and outreach events like Cops for Kids Day and Charlottesville Night Out, which celebrates police and community. To clarify, we are an independent 501c3 nonprofit, and while we partner with the Charlottesville Police Department, we do not report to the CPD or to the City Council or any part of the city government. We are not a police union, nor do we do the work commonly associated with police unions. To the extent that we advocate for the CPD, it is to improve the quality of policing as a community service. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Sergeant Greg Wade was hired by the Charlottesville Police Department in 2004 as a community service officer. He became a sworn law enforcement officer in 2006 and joined the ranks of the Charlottesville Police Department. Since then, he has worked as first and second shift patrol officer. He was promoted to sergeant in 2014 and was assigned to patrol division. Regretfully, Lieutenant Michael Gore, who was to present today with Sergeant Wade, is not able to join us. And note that you can add your questions to the question section on your screen, on the lower part of your screen, but we'll hold them until the end of the presentation. Sergeant Wade, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. So as Gail said, I'm Sergeant Wade. To add just a little bit more to the resume, and hearing 2004 sounds, gosh, that was a long time ago. I started in internal affairs about 2 years ago, May of 2019. So I've been in this office for 2 years and a handful of months. What I'd like to talk about today is the Office of Professional Standards, Internal Affairs, our mission, the work we do, the intake and investigation of citizen complaints, and their outcomes. We'll also delve into how that affects the community and the steps we take to ensure transparency in our investigations, both with our officers, as well as transparency for the community at large. So they're able to get a clear picture of the work we do as it pertains to their interests. So we'll get into this. So to begin with, we'll go over a little bit of the role of internal affairs, the role it plays within the police department, and the policy that governs how we do our job. So first and foremost, as I mentioned before, the department works to ensure an open and transparent investigation. That's especially important for the officer who is under investigation, so they know exactly what to expect from the investigation. They understand the outcomes of the investigation. That's also important for the community, whether that be the complainant who's brought forward their complaint or their concern in reference to their interaction with our officers, or the community at large if the complaint revolves around a matter of public interest. Prior to a complaint being filed, the department does take a systematic approach to identifying and addressing potential problems before a complaint is needed to be filed or necessary. These can include report reviews by first-line supervisors or body camera reviews by first-line supervisors. Both of these mechanisms allow us to glean information from officer contacts with individuals on a day-to-day basis to ensure that the officers are providing the people they serve, the public, with the best possible service. That also allows us to address and correct any deficiencies or problems that we see arising prior to a complaint needing to be filed or a citizen feeling compelled to bring forward a concern or a complaint to the department for investigation. Once a complaint has been filed, the investigation of said complaint will be conducted with the strictest confidentiality. That's both to protect the officer who's the subject of the complaint, as well as the citizen who's filed the complaint. It's very important to keep in mind the rights, concerns, and privacy of all parties involved as it pertains to these matters, as they're often very sensitive in nature, and the confidentiality really needs to be adhered to strictly in order to get the best possible outcome. Complaints are investigated in a fair and impartial manner. We like to say in our office that we're strictly fact-based. We look at the facts of the case, what our investigation has uncovered, or what we've been able to discover through review of body-worn camera footage or other evidence, and look at a very thorough investigation that is able to answer all of the questions and concerns posed by the complainant about their interaction with our officer. So we'll talk a little bit about the procedure now, how complaints are taken in, how they're received, how they can be made by the general public, and what happens with the complaint once it's been made as it moves through the police department's system of investigation and review. I'll go over these bullet points that are up on the screen now. Each of them I'll speak more in depth about as we move through the show. So this just kind of provides an overview of the complaint process, if you will. So first we'll talk about making and receiving complaints. There's information posted on the department's website as well as in the lobby of the police department that provides information on how a citizen can make a complaint. Recently, we've moved an electronic copy of the complaint form online that allows people to file complaints paperlessly. The complaint form can be accessed from the City of Charlottesville Police Department's website fairly easily. Once you access that, it gives you the form. You're able to fill it out and submit it. If you choose to go the paperless route, that submission then goes to an internal affairs email, as well as to the chief of police and the commanders, so that they're all aware that a complaint has been filed. That's the easiest way, I would say, if you're able to access a computer to file a complaint. There's also the option to come into the lobby, speak with the supervisor, and you have the ability to file a complaint with them, as we've done in years past prior to the digital complaint form. Once the complaint comes in, it comes to our office, to internal affairs. We'll then look at the complaint and begin our investigation. At the outset of the investigation, we'll determine whether the allegations made in the citizen complaint detail allegations that would constitute a complaint, or detail allegations that would constitute an inquiry. And the difference between a complaint and inquiry is one that I'll go over on this next slide. After that, we give a response to the complainant, letting them know that we've received the complaint. We'll also notify the officers and begin our evidence gathering and review portion of our investigation. So we'll move along to the next slide. As I said, we'll talk now about the difference between an inquiry and a complaint. We're going to investigate all complaints and inquiries the same way. The difference is in what the allegation is. So inquiries are defined as matters of concern brought forth to the department which do not rise to a level that would be considered a violation of department policy and or a violation of the law. Complaints are matters of concern brought forth to the department alleging a violation or violations of department policy and or a violation of the law. So an example of that would be questions about officer actions where no policy or law violations occurred would be considered as inquiries. And oftentimes in these cases, an explanation of what actions were taken and the reasoning behind them can be and are provided to the subject making the inquiry. An example of that would be if you received a traffic ticket and your complaint isn't that you've received the ticket, but that you don't believe that the officer should have charged you with this specific code section that they charged you with. You're not complaining about receipt of the ticket in and of itself. You're specifically questioning why the officer chose the code section they did. Example of a complaint using that same analogy or that same example of a traffic stop would be if you were stopped for speeding and you don't believe you were speeding, you believe that the officer stopped you for no reason, or you believe that you were traveling under the speed limit. That wouldn't be a question of or a question or concern about the specific violation. It would be a complaint alleging that the officer stopped you and didn't have a constitutionally backed reason to do so. So that would be the main difference between inquiries and complaints. Performance and demeanor complaints, which are going to be some of our more common complaints, typically allege an inappropriate action or response by an employee, improper operation of a police vehicle, violation of a department policy or employee rules of conduct, or any other act or failure to act that does not rise to an allegation of misconduct. So now that we kind of have the background for complaints and inquiries and the basic kind of backbone, if you will, for how they move through the department, we'll dive into the complaint process. So once a complaint has been received, we'll make a notification of receipt of that complaint to both the complainant and the officer. The complainant will receive a letter from us. If the complainant has provided an email address, we'll typically send them an email which contains that letter. If they prefer to be contacted through the postal service, we can send them a physical copy of that letter as well, just detailing our receipt of their complaint and the actions that will be undertaken in investigating it. The officer who's the subject of the complaint will also receive a notice of complaint, which contains the complaint form filled out by the complainant. This is done both to notify the officer that there's a complaint that's been filed, and also provides them with the basis of the complaint so that they're familiar with what the complaint is for when they come in for their interview. Once we've notified both the complainant and the officer that there's a complaint that we've received, we'll begin gathering evidence and facts. Typically, what we'll begin with first is any body-worn camera footage. It's a policy of the Charlottesville Police Department that all citizen interactions with officers be captured on their body-worn cameras. All of our officers are issued body-worn cameras. So what we'll first start by doing is looking at and categorizing the body-worn camera footage from the underlying incident that the complaint stems from. We'll get that, ensure that we've identified all body-worn camera footage from involved officers, any other officers who may have been witnesses to the underlying incident. So we'll ensure we'll have that. We also will work to identify all parties who were witnesses to or involved in the incident where the complaint stemmed from. So for instance, if the complainant is a member of a group that officers interacted with and they file a complaint based on that interaction, we'll work to identify the other members of the group in order to get the best possible description or the best possible look at what occurred. We'll also work to identify any other officers who would have responded to that incident or that call. So we're able to speak with everyone who was involved, not strictly just the complainant and the officer. Once we've done that, we'll begin our interviews. Typically, what we like to do is speak with the complainant first. That gives us a basis of the complaint, that gives us a foundation to begin with. It gives them an opportunity to voice their concerns and talk about the incident, how they felt during the incident, what they believe the shortcomings or concerns were with the officers that they interacted with. After that, we'll interview any witnesses to the event, and then we'll interview the officers and any other officers who may have witnessed or been a part of responding to or handling the underlying incident that the complaint stems from. After that's completed, we will review all of the evidence collected and type an executive summary. The summary details the known facts. It details all of the interviews that we've done. And based on all of the evidence and statements collected throughout our investigation, a finding will be reached. And I will go into the findings a few slides down the line to explain each of those and how they are found. Once a finding has been reached, we'll recommend that finding and the complaint will be reviewed. In the instance where the complaint is against, say, a patrol officer, an officer who's out working the street, once our investigation has been completed, the file will go to the division commander for field operations, that's patrol, for their review. They're able to review it. They review all of the facts of the case. They review all of the interviews, all of the evidence that we used, body-worn camera footage, statements from the complainants, and so on. And they'll make a determination as to whether or not they agree or disagree with the findings that Internal Affairs has reached. Once that has been done, if they agree, the complaint moves on to the next step in the ladder, in the chain of command. That would be to the Assistant Chief of Police for their review. They undertake the same steps that the patrol commander undertakes. And then after they approve, it moves to the Chief of Police for final approval. Assuming that each of those steps is met with agreement on the findings of internal affairs, the case is considered approved at that point, and we are able to then provide notice to both the officer and complainant of the case's closure. When we provide the closure letter to the complainant, we detail the findings. We also provide a summary to them as to the steps we took in investigating the complaint. We talk about what evidence we considered in making our determination. And we talk about our final determination based on said evidence. One note down here at the bottom, this is a relatively new addition to our policy and procedure. Complaints received after 12 months will not be investigated unless the allegation of the complainant states that there's some type of conduct which would constitute criminally felonious activity. Examples of that would be felonious assault, grand larceny, things of that nature. The reasoning for this is most more minor complaints, if you will, are going to be best investigated when they're relatively close to the time that they occurred. That gives us the best possible chance for coming up with the best factual analysis of the complaint. There will still be body-worn camera footage. The recollections of both the complainants and the officers will still be fresh, and we'll have the best opportunity to determine exactly what happened and give a good, solid investigative report to our command staff for review. And I'll stop just for a moment. I see that there's a question from Mr. Bruner about the number of complaints we get per year. And I would say it fluctuates. On average, I would say we get between 30 and 40 complaints per year that are investigated by the police department. And in terms of if it's gone up, stayed the same, or gone down, it fluctuates. My first year in the office, I think we were north of 50, but for this year we're on pace for about 40. And last year we had, I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was 37. So like I said, it goes back and forth. I honestly don't feel that I've been in this office for long enough to get a good handle on what a rolling average would look like for, say, 5 or 8 years to get a good feeling for that. So as I told you before, complaints are found with one of the 4 findings that are listed here. These findings pertain to our investigation and the facts that we've been able to glean from officer statements, complainant statements, and the body-worn camera footage. I'll read through these and explain each of them. They're all fairly self-explanatory, but we'll delve into them a little bit. The first is sustained. Sustained means that the allegations made in the complaint are true, and the officer is determined to have acted in violation of applicable policy, techniques, or regulations. Not resolved means that we're unable to determine whether the complaint is true or false, or the complainant's allegations are true or false. Not resolved cases are fairly few and far between these days, especially with how prolific body-worn camera footage is. Typically in the past, not resolved cases stemmed from one-on-one officer and civilian interactions where there was no independent witness or evidence to support either the officer's actions or the complainant's actions. In this office, like I said, we're fact-based, so we don't want to take one person's word strictly over another person's. We want to have facts and evidence to support the conclusions we make. The next is exonerated. Exonerated means that the allegations are true, but the officer is not guilty of any misconduct due to adherence to applicable policy, techniques, or regulations. An example of someone who might be, or a time at which an exonerated complaint might be found or have a finding of exonerated would be if someone complains, say that their complaint revolves around stop for speeding. They're issued a ticket for speeding and they complain that the officer stopped them for speeding. And if they didn't believe they were speeding, you could say, or you could look at the officer's body-worn camera footage. Maybe you're able to tell, yes, they were speeding. In that instance, and you're kind of flirting on the line there between exonerated and the next one, which would be unfounded. But if they said they were, maybe they say they were speeding, but they weren't speeding as fast as the officer said they were. Their complaint would be that the officer stopped them for speeding when they weren't. However, if you go back and look, you're able to determine through your investigation, utilizing the evidence and the facts at your disposal that they were, you could say, yes, you know, your complaint is that the officer stopped you for speeding. We're able to determine after reviewing the facts of the case that you were in fact speeding. So the complaint that the officer stopped them for speeding would be found, or the officer would be found in that complaint as exonerated based on the fact that, yes, the complainant is correct in that they were stopped for speeding and that's what their complaint is. However, the officer is also correct in stopping them for speeding. That's a fairly rough example of an exonerated finding. The last would be unfounded. And as I said, the exonerated and unfounded can kind of get close together from time to time, but unfounded is there's no basis or fact, or excuse me, no basis of fact to support the allegations made in the complaint. A lot of our complaints end up with this finding, and that's all, I would say, mostly all due to the prevalence of body-worn camera footage. When we're able to go in and remove bias and any other interceding beliefs from the complaint and distill it down to the officer speaking to the complainant, we're able to oftentimes cut out a lot of the, like I said, bias and other factors that contribute to negative interactions with officers. So we'll move into speaking about Garrity now. Garrity is something that we work with a lot in internal affairs specifically. It's an important investigative tool that we have, which allows us to conduct a more thorough investigation. I'll talk a little bit about what Garrity is, and then we'll talk about how it applies to the internal affairs investigations that we conduct. So first off, Garrity rights protect public employees from being compelled to incriminate themselves during investigatory interviews conducted by their employers. This protection stems from the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which of course declares that the government cannot compel a person to be a witness against him or herself. Garrity stems from a 1961 court case, Garrity versus New Jersey. In that court case, the New Jersey Attorney General had begun an investigation into ticket fixing. As a result of that, Chief Edward Garrity of the Belmar Police was questioned along with 5 other employees. Each was warned that anything they said might be used against them in a criminal proceeding, and that they could refuse to answer questions in order to avoid self-incrimination. However, they were also told that if they refused to answer, they would be terminated. Rather than lose their jobs, they answered the investigators' questions. Their statements were used in their prosecutions over their objections, and they were convicted. The US Supreme Court took up the case, and in 1967's Garrity versus New Jersey, they stated that the employee statements made under threat of termination were compelled by the state in violation of the 5th and 14th Amendment. The decision asserted that the option to lose their means of livelihood or pay the penalty of self-incrimination is the antithesis of free choice to speak or remain silent. Therefore, because the employee's statements were compelled, it was unconstitutional to use their statements in a prosecution, and their convictions were subsequently overturned. So that's the backstory to Garrity. Actually, let me go back to this 1 second. How that applies to internal affairs today relates directly to what the Supreme Court had to say. Garrity allows us to compel employees to speak in an administrative investigation. It's what allows us to sit across from an officer and have the full expectation that they're going to provide us with a full statement about the complaint that they're involved in without omitting facts or being untruthful. What Garrity does to protect the officer is it lets them know that they're participating in an investigation that's purely administrative. That is to say that if there are any criminal components of the investigation, once Garrity comes into play, you're no longer able to pursue those criminal components. The one area where that gets somewhat tricky, and you have to be incredibly careful, is in complaints or incidents where there is a criminal component that needs to be investigated prior to Garrity being given. That's why oftentimes you'll see like on news coverage of officer-involved shootings or things of that nature, you'll often hear the news say, the criminal investigation is complete, they're still waiting on the administrative investigation. That's because Garrity does not allow 2 investigations to run concurrently. The criminal investigation has to begin and be adjudicated prior to the administrative investigation taking place. Because once your Garrity warnings have been given, you're no longer subject to, and the statements that you make can be used in your administrative investigation and any findings that come from that, but they cannot be used against you in a criminal investigation, because that flies in the face of the 5th and 14th Amendment, as Garrity pointed out. So getting away from Garrity for a moment, talk just generally about how investigations are conducted. We try to work with the officers to meet with them at a time and place that's conducive or convenient to them. As you can see, the Code of Virginia says that questioning of the officer shall take place at a reasonable time and place as designated by the investigating officer. So, we're not going to have a midnight officer or an officer who worked overnight come in at 2 p.m. after they've worked to give a statement in an investigation for a complaint that they've received. That wouldn't be self-serving to the officer, and it certainly wouldn't assist in the investigation, as we wouldn't be catching them at a time that would allow them to be clear-headed and ready to provide a full and complete statement to us. Additionally, prior to the officer being questioned, the officer will be informed of the name and rank of the investigating officer, that is the person undertaking the investigation, any other persons to be present during the interview, and the nature of the investigation. Typically, as I said before, when we spoke about the way our complaints are taken in, the officer has already received a copy of the complaint and is able to understand and view the concerns that have been brought forward by the complainant prior to any questioning. So we'll talk now about the Civilian Review Board. This is a board that's still kind of up and coming in Charlottesville. They've recently hired a new executive director, which is exciting. So a little background, back on December 18th of 2017, the City Council adopted a resolution to establish an initial Police Civilian Review Board. That board concluded its work on July 1st, 2019, and adopted proposed bylaws and a proposed ordinance. They presented these proposals to the City Council at the Council's August 5th, 2019 meeting. And as you know, the board is now up and running. The board may consider matters that occurred on or after the date of the City Council's adoption of the bylaws and ordinance, and complaints to the board can be made within 75 days of the complainant receiving the determination letter or the complaint closure letter. That's the letter we spoke about earlier. In the event that the complainant doesn't agree with the department's findings or has further questions that they feel need to be answered by the Police Civilian Review Board, they have that 75-day window in which to file a complaint with them in reference to the complaint they filed with the department. And here's just a quick snapshot of the complaints we received in 2020. As you can see, the majority of them relate to officer performance and courtesy. Those are our two main types of complaint we received. I would say that 2020 was a fairly standard year in terms of the ratio of performance and courtesy complaints to other complaints. Performance complaints typically revolve around complainants questioning an officer's actions or questioning the manner in which the officer conducted himself in relation to the work they did. Courtesy complaints are self-explanatory. Complainants feeling that the officers were rude or spoke coarsely to them during their contact with them. We also have our next largest pie slice after performance and courtesy is bias-based policing. We took 5 of those complaints in 2020. Those are complaints that allege a bias, racial or otherwise, from the officer towards the complainant during their interaction. The others are smaller and more infrequent, but you can still get an idea of the type we get based on the chart there. And I'll take any questions you have. take an opportunity to rest my voice.
Good. That was amazing. That's so interesting. And there are a couple of questions regarding the Civilian Review Board and internal affairs. Can a complaint be initiated first to the Civilian Review Board? Is there an option to do either, or does it have to go to internal affairs first?
So it would come to us first. I will say that here recently, a lot of people, I believe, are more comfortable speaking to the Civilian Review Board. So we'll actually get emails from them that contain citizen complaints. It won't necessarily be the complaint form that we spoke about earlier, but it would be an email whose body details concerns about an officer's interaction. So the Civilian Review Board sends that to us, and from that, or based on that, we're able to initiate the investigative process.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. Are we allowed to know if an individual has complaints filed against them?
So that gets to the one of the kind of the main roadblocks that we run up against as it pertains to transparency. We'll give as much information about the complaint as we can, but at the end of the day, the complaints, and especially the disciplinary procedures arising from those complaints in the instances where they're sustained, are confidential personnel matters. So to answer your question, and I would assume we're asking, like if you wanted to know if Officer Smith, for example, has a complaint filed or has had complaints filed against him. I would say the answer to that would probably be no, for a person just asking, just out of curiosity. Obviously, if you're a complainant or a person who's filed a complaint against Officer Smith, you'd be privy to all of the information about that complaint, except for the disciplinary actions that arise out of it, should it be found sustained.
Thank you. So another question, is the Civilian Review Board now operational, and what impact is the CRB having on internal affairs? Is it making your work more difficult?
Yeah, the Civilian Review Board is operational. They're taking in cases. I'm not yet aware of a case that they have or that someone has taken to them for review after our findings. In terms of making work more difficult, no. Our communications with them are all done through email, and it's been fairly easy going. I've developed a working relationship with several of their members. We share emails back and forth in terms of the intake of complaints and the resolution of complaints. And just to expound on that a little bit, there was a point I meant to mention way back when we spoke about the complaint form. Our complaint form now, as a result of the Civilian Review Board's creation, now contains a box where you can check to select whether the complaint goes to the Civilian Review Board or whether you would rather it just be kept with the Charlottesville Police Department. If you select yes, you want it to go to the Civilian Review Board, we will send them a copy of your complaint, and they will also receive the complaint closure letter that is sent to you, which details the findings of the complaint, the investigation that was undertaken, the facts that were considered, so on and so forth.
What we were saying prior to this presentation starting, the event of the hiring of the new executive director is in fact exciting when you see the law enforcement background of this individual. And I think in my opinion, it's going to be very good for the review board, for the department, and for the community. So there's a follow-up question. Just 1 second. What ongoing mechanisms are in place to review the departmental procedures, techniques, and regulations, as well as review of interpretation for these? For example, is implicit bias, and an example is DEI training, et cetera.
So we're constantly reviewing our policy and procedure to ensure that it keeps with best practices. It's in terms of implicit bias, I will say probably 2 years ago now, we receive in-service training each year. And I would say at least for 2 years now, there's been a specific module on recognizing and managing implicit bias. That has been really good. I think it's opened a lot of eyes and made people think a lot about how their actions are interpreted, whether or not they believe they're interpreted in one way, but making people more aware that just because they feel one way, their actions, their words can still be interpreted in another sense by the person they're speaking with. So I think that that's been a very beneficial training that has, like I said, it's opened some eyes, which I think is a good thing.
Right. Great. Thank you. Another question, do fellow officers resent you and your work or respect what you are doing for the department and the community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always joke around with my wife because invariably, and the law enforcement centered or kind of cop drama style TVs or movies, internal affairs is always kind of like the boogeyman over in the dark corner of the room waiting to kind of pounce and mess up whatever the protagonist has going on. I would say it's in the eye of the beholder. They might resent me, they might respect me. What I attempt to do for the officers and for the community is to conduct the investigations based on the facts at hand, recognize any biases or other things that might impact that investigation and do my best to mitigate those. So I'm presenting a purely fact-based and unbiased investigation into the complaint that provides the clearest picture and the fairest outcome for all parties involved.
That's a great answer. So one final question. I know that there's all kinds of information available on the city's website. The pie chart that you showed and the outcomes and the information that the city's making available to us can be found where and what is in that section? And I missed if you said so.
Yes. Yeah, I was gonna say, and I'm glad you asked that because that was another piece of the transparency that I wanted to talk about. Beginning in 2019, the city police department began publishing a lot of data on our investigatory detentions, as well as our internal affairs cases. The amount of cases we had, their outcomes, and the demographics of the complainants and the officers, along with the complaint receipt date and the complaint closure date. This was all done in order to promote transparency and try to give the public at large an idea of the workings of internal affairs. So all of that information can be found on the City of Charlottesville Police Department's webpage. There's a tab, I believe it's to the left, when you open that page, when you navigate to it, that is labeled Department Data. And in that, you can find all of the information that I just spoke of. We're updating our internal affairs information throughout the year, typically about once a month, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, that gets updated with our current cases. And you can actually go back and look. Like I said, we started around 2019, but we actually put up archived information that goes back to 2017. So you can look at 2017 through August 2021, I believe is the last time it was updated.
Okay, great. Great. Well, that was a really, really complete and really interesting presentation. Thank you so much, Sergeant Wade. And it's also so timely. I mean, it's wonderful to have this information now. The next Lunch and Learn presentation will be on ECC, which is Emergency Communications Center, assuring community access to emergency services. And that will be presented by Sunny Saxton, who's their executive director. It's scheduled for October 20th, Wednesday at noon, and we hope to see you there. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you again, Sergeant Wade.
Thank you.